First of all, thank you so much for joining me and giving me your time. I know you're incredibly busy, so I'm really honored to share this space with you.
You're more than welcome. I met you through the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness graduate program here in San Francisco that
Yes,
that I founded, and I think you were in my very last course that I
I
taught
was. I
before I
was.
retired after 30 years there.
I
So
was.
that's it's kind of nice to be able to continue the conversation, so to speak.
Yes, indeed. That was a seminal course for me, and I actually learned of the word or the term Kairos first from you. I heard it first through you, so it feels quite fitting actually to be having this conversation with you now. Um, I thought we could kick off then with the quote from Jung, where he says, "We are living in what the Greeks called the Kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principle and symbols." You spoke many times about this moment in history as being a sort of archetypal threshold. I'd love it if you could just unpack Kairos, what it is, and how it differentiates from Kronos, and perhaps allude to the myth, to the Greek myth.
Yes, I mean, Jung wrote those words in 1956. So at that point, he's 80 years old, um, 5 years older than I am now. It was in the early part of 1956, and it's in an essay called "The Undiscovered Self."
Mm,
And the background to that sentence is that he is talking about how the arts of a culture tend to carry, in a sense, in advance, an intimation of what's emerging out of the deep archetypal psyche, collective psyche, and and that he felt the way the arts are have been expressing themselves over the course of the 20th century was a kind of intimation of a larger kind of deconstruction, dissolution of the structures and foundations of our life world in a sense. And the larger I don't know, do you have the larger paragraph of that quote? It's I can bring
Um,
it quickly if you
yes, yes, yes. Well, the next sentence is this peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious human within who is changing.
that's right. And
Yeah.
then and he and so that the idea of the kairos, it originally is a Greek term that refers to the that exactly right moment where there is the possibility, the opportunity that is fleeting in order for the arrow to go from the bow and penetrate its target exactly right at that, or it sometimes is used in weaving to just be able to kind of thread right at the right moment as the weaving process is unfolding. And so it's a more general term that just refers to the the opportunity, the right moment for a something important to unfold, and it requires a kind of alertness on our part to respond to it. But it also is getting at a larger understanding of time, and it is pointing to a different kind of time sense than our characteristic modern sense of time, which is that time is entirely kind of homogeneous, horizontal, and neutral. It just one moment follows another, and in itself, time is just quantitative, and you can measure it by clock and calendar. But so chron that's chronological time, as it
Yeah.
were. But kairotic time, referring
Yeah.
to kairos, refers to a sense of time as having intrinsic qualities, that there's a qualitative, not just quantitative dimension. That's not part of the usual modern worldview, which is very, kind of
Mm.
Newtonian Cartesian still in its understanding. And the idea of the kairos and of kairotic time is that there are there's a qualitative dimension that informs each moment, and that there are certain times when in this case, Jung is talking about the right time for a fundamental transformation, for a transformation of our fundamental principles and symbols, a changing of the gods, as it were. And he's picking up on something that's, in some sense, even more vividly true today, almost 70 years later, namely that the very foundational assumptions and principles and many of the ideals of our modern civilization are being challenged, undercut, even failing in the face of the unfolding of history right now and the unfolding of Earth's evolution. So he's already picking up on that 70 years ago and making a very strong statement that this isn't entirely of our choosing. It's very much part of a larger kind of archetypal unfolding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But he says, does the individual, a little later in the same essay, he says, does the individual know that he or she is the make weight that will determine the whole future, the unfolding of this kairotic moment? That yes, it has been set in motion by much larger forces than just our individual decisions and so forth, but that it is up to us with that kind of spark of agency, of autonomy, of our free will, of our sense of moral responsibility to respond to this crisis. It's up to us to play a participatory role in how it unfolds. We're not
Mm.
by in any means in charge of it. We are
But we're players on the stage. We have to play
that's
out the
right,
drama.
right. That's right. And the outcome in is greatly affected by us, even though we're not master captain of our fate in some,
Yeah.
you know, hubristic modern fantasy of man.
Mm, mm.
And then one other thing about that's worth mentioning
Yeah.
about the difference between Kairos and Kronos and different res relationships to time. And this goes back to a wonderful book that by Charles Taylor, in which, and particularly, this is the book A Secular Age, his
Mm-hmm.
kind of masterwork of historical narrative and both philosophical, religious, social, and moral meta narrative in a way of the last couple thousand years of history and where we are today. And he makes the point that up until the modern period, when there was a kind of when there was a kind of radical transformation in our experience of time and our conception of time. Up until then, time was a much more complex phenomenon, like in the Middle Ages, for example, or among the ancients, where you had, on the one hand, you had the unfolding of clock time or let's say sundial time, the calendar, the Julian calendar, for example, or any other calendar. There, on the one hand, there's this chronological, kind of neutral quantitative unfolding. But within that continuum, each moment has a relationship to other dimensions where there's a like a vertical. It's not just a
Mm.
horizontal continuum of time. There's a vertical dimension that informs the each moment. And there are different this this is what he refers to as higher times compared to the secular time of the mundane world. And these higher times have different renderings. For example, for many in the ancient world, and this continued right up until through the Renaissance, time was also being shaped and informed by the movements of the heavens, which were associated with the movements of the gods or of archetypal principles, forces that have a cosmic grounding. And each moment is reflecting a different
Mm.
configuration of archetypal dynamics that makes certain things possible. So that's kind of like and it's a very cyclical
Yeah.
in the same way that the heavens
Yeah.
and the what we now know as the Earth's movement and the movements of the planets and so forth around the sun. But all of these are there's a
Mm.
cyclical quality to them that he that is very much part of that particular Platonic, Aristotelian, archaic sense of higher times penetrating our experience of chronological time. But then there's also the kind of time that particularly comes in through the Judeo-Christian tradition and the biblical disclosures, which have a sense that, as Taylor puts it, I mean, we just had Easter Sunday last week and Good Friday and so forth. And as he points out, for all of European Christendom, which completely saturated that continent in the Middle Ages and much of the modern period too, there is when you come into Easter, you come into Christmas, you come into Lent, Good Friday, etc., you are tapping into a a very powerful reality that, in a sense, unites you, let's say, with every other Easter in history, is closer to you right now than last a few months ago was to you, because you're
Mm. Mm.
participating in a
Yes.
higher form of time. And
Yeah.
then there's one other that is even more primordial understanding of time or experience of time, which is part of the whole indigenous and tribal wisdom traditions and just part of life experience. And that is that there is a time before time that was a great time and of origins, a time of origins that has, in a sense, an archetypal quality that imprints itself and it has a kind of greater than ordinary ontological potency, and that even in the present, you can tap into that primordial time of origins and
Mm.
great in ritual states. And so in could be with a sacred medicine, a vision plant. It could be with all sorts of other methods of breathing, dancing, etc. The entire tribal society could tap into like the dream time and essentially be able to experience that time of origins, and these greater beings that were part of the creative origin come right into one, and one is possessed by them, and you speak their words and sense their vivid reality within yourself. Not just like I'm pretending to be this
Yeah.
being. You are
Yeah.
that being at
Yes.
that time.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
those
Thank you.
so the beauty of the this understanding of time is just how complex it is, how richer it is, and there's a qualitative dimension.
Mm.
And when Jung is using this word kairos at that moment, or in that passage,
Yeah.
he is getting at the fact that civilization itself has reached a kind of
Like an
absolute,
apogee,
what's that?
like a kind of apogee or a nadir, conversely, like it's reached its culmination,
Right, and
or it has to
a
shift into
crisis
a
point,
new,
and a crisis point.
and a nadir, exactly. It's a kind of it's a zenith, and it's also the kind of the very pit it's
Yeah,
reaching.
the nadir,
End
yeah.
point, it's end game, you know?
Yes, and so as is often said about like the Chinese have the same word for crisis and opportunity. It's along
Interesting.
that line,
Right.
and that we have this potential that he's recognizing prophetically to respond to a moment when it's kind of like a bifurcation moment when you have more potency in determining the future than you would in a less chaotic moment.
Right.
So
Was the kind of edge of chaos, like before a system, before a
yeah,
kind of phase shift, right? We hit the edge of
phase
chaos.
shift, a recalibration of everything, etc.
Yeah.
I think what people like yourself and I are very interested in is not only how do we respond to it in terms of a kind of, using all our current scientific, technological knowledge and capacities and so forth, but also it's been part of the modern trajectory to suppress or downplay, negate the the insights, the wisdom, the access to higher or deeper dimensions of reality that
Mm.
past eras and other cultures and our own culture and other times, and also suppressed parts of our own culture, like the esoteric traditions, they had access to realities that we might not have access to now.
Yeah.
And so this is also a time of becoming more whole. We have all these layers in us, but a lot of those layers that have spiritual and moral sources that we have suppressed our access to. And if we can do the deep work of reconnecting to that depth, which involves a kind of dying to our old identity and our old structures of confident assessment of what reality is. We have to kind of become humble, like little children, and open
Mm.
up to the fact that we have a lot to learn from many other cultures, many other eras, wisdom traditions, spiritual insights from the arts, etc. So that's part of our crisis moment, in a sense, is this possibility of moving into a greater sense of depth and wholeness. And that involves a kind of dying to the preceding commitment we had as moderns to the sense that the human being, and particularly man, as it was often
Hmm.
just personified in this masculine way, and even with capital M for man, that 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 considered himself superior to and separate from nature, and nature's there for his exploitation, brilliant understanding, and then development of its resources simply for one's own self-enhancement. And as a result, that hubris of thinking we're not part of the whole, and thinking that our intelligence and imagination and aspirations are just our possession, and rather than the fact that we are the cosmos and we are the earth in human form, and our illusion of separateness and superiority is a kind of inflated state
Yeah.
of hubris that
Yeah.
calls forth a fall, as the
Yeah.
Greeks understood very well.
Well, hubris invites nemesis, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I love this depiction. Thank you so much. That was so rich. I love this depiction of a kind of aesthetically inflected and souled temporality. That's what I was really hearing from you about these different orders of time or different relationships to time that we've since lost. And when you spoke about kind of gaining a sort of childlike enchantment, it reminded me of William Blake. Obviously, the kind of songs of innocence are sort of not in a childish way, but a return, a returning to that, the purity, right? And hence he spoke about the songs of experience as well. I think the key for us is to somehow synthesize the two, experience, the experience we've gained in this material realm, but then also, yeah, somehow synthesizing that, synergizing that with this childlike innocence that will allow us to see the world in its beauty, in its glory, and in its magnificence, as I
Yes.
imagine archaic people would have done when they were painting on the walls of caves. Something else I wanted to pick up
Could
on
I
that
just
you mentioned.
quickly, could I
Yes,
quickly insert
yes,
there
yes.
for that part of your audience that, like us, is interested in depth psychology, Jung and James Hillman's work, archetypal psychology, and so forth. What you've just described, like Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and the necessity of a kind of synthesis
Mm.
of opposites,
Mm. Mm.
and in that cycle, in the depth psychology tradition, you have that's basically the puer eternus, the eternal child,
Right.
and then the senex, the young and the old,
Mm.
the newborn and the aging. And what is, if you just have one without the other, problems unfold in over time. And so there has to be, we are constantly moving towards a kind of dialectical synthesis of those two.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the divine child archetype, and why we refer to it at this moment, of kind of, in a sense, like you need to be like a child again. It, rebirth, the whole rebirth archetype, and it's predicated on having gone through a dying, and that the dying does not completely obliterate the past. The dying goes into the soil in some sense and becomes the part of the newborn of the future. And there's a that's why the divine child is the consequence of the sacred marriage.
Yeah.
And the sacred marriage is a conjunctio oppositorum, hieros gamos in Greek, sacred marriage, that doesn't come just by our act of will. It comes as a kind of combination of our participation and the grace of a kind of cosmic blessing of what Jung called the transcendent function.
Yeah.
And the only way to get to that is not by simply willing it, but by holding the faithfully the tension of opposites, whether it's between puer and senex, old and young, new and future and past, or masculine and feminine, solar and lunar, the part and the whole, night and day. All those great polarities have to, in some sense, we have to be faithful to both sides of those, not suppress one and go to an easy affirmation of the other, but rather in a kind, as he said, Jung says, we have to be, in a sense, crucified between the opposites in order to allow ourselves to be the vessel for this conjunctio oppositorum, that there seems to be something built into the creative impulse of cosmic evolution or psychological, or what Jung's focus was, psychological evolution, development, movement towards wholeness. There's something in it that has this capacity to bring together two seemingly irreconcilable sides of a polarity into a higher synthesis that in some sense fulfills both of them, but is also more than what was there before, but only because one has opened oneself to a kind of suffering the tension before the
Yes.
creative aha, and then it emerges with like the the child from the great mother.
Yes, I've just been reading some of Mary Louise von Franz's Number and Time, and she's
Oh yeah,
talking about the kind of phasal numerical development of the psyche and how we need to have a sort of sequencing of our life and this unfoldment. And she also speaks about well, this kind of alchemical marriage that you've just delineated, and obviously, Jungian thought with regards to this to the quaternity, right? The kind of, the first position is a sort of inner conflict, or sort of, no, that's the second part. The first part is the unconscious material, which is an issue, but then you become conscious of it. That's number two. And there's an inner conflict. Then the third is the sort of synthesis. And then the
yes,
fourth, as I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a sort of integration of that. It's the kind of extra component that emerges out of that process. Is that
yeah,
right?
that's great, and I'm glad you brought Marie-Louise von Franz up there. And I love the fact that you're in the country of both Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, and they they both would be there on Lago Maggiore and in earlier years, though she was quite a bit younger than Jung, as a close student of his, probably the one he felt the closest to in the later decades. And she is very profound. And what you're by bringing her in, and particularly that point about the relationship of the unconscious to consciousness, that in many ways is the central, certainly one of the central polarities and dynamics that Jung is talking about
Yeah.
with respect to the transcendent function. Um,
Yeah. I've also
he
been
he doesn't
reading,
want to go
sorry.
on one, or he doesn't want to just be dominated by one or the other. You can get swallowed up by the unconscious, as he
Yeah.
almost felt it might happen to him when he was going through the Red Book period in the 19 teens and 20s. But if you just identify with consciousness without recognizing that you have all these such a bigger, deeper reality within you that's also shaping events, then you're in trouble. You'll be a puppet of the unconscious
Yeah.
and be quite more likely to cause problems. I'm sorry I interrupted you though.
No,
Go.
not at all. I was just getting a bit over enthusiastic because I've also been reading Answer to Job. I've got a
Oh yeah,
seminar on it tomorrow with Becca and Sean actually on Answer to Job. And it's fascinating to me that Yahweh, who is ostensibly omniscient, well, he is omniscient, can then have can have unconsciousness and can choose to consult his omniscience or not. I just find this really I'm finding it really difficult to sort of process. Obviously, if he's couched as a kind of Gnostic demiurge, it makes sense because he's not truly divine. But the idea of a divine being omniscient and yet having unconscious contents that he can project so violently onto his own creation. I mean,
yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Jung is working through, Answer to Job, which he wrote in 1951, right after the papal declaration of the Assumptio Mariae, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which he felt was the most important religious event since the in the West since the Reformation, because it recognized the full parity, equality, dignity, spiritual elevation of the feminine relative to the masculine. And he said the recognition of the Assumption of Mary, the bodily Assumption of Mary, it was a recognition of the feminine and also of the body as having divine status. And it was also a correction to the one-sided masculinity and sort of transcendentalism of the Christian tradition. Particularly, he got on the case of Protestantism as being, which he came out of himself, which he said is if it doesn't recognize the importance of this, it will be nothing but a man's religion. He said it almost with kind of disgust. And so that's yeah, I feel like Answer to Job was a very powerful, he said, of all the things later towards the very end of his life, that was already just 10 years before he died. But at near the very end of his life, he looked back and said, Answer to Job is the only piece of writing that I would not change one word in now. Almost anything else that I've written, I could see it really could be revised this way or that way, as I now understand it. But he said, Answer to Job, he said it came through like in a state of white heat inspiration. And I don't want it to seem like it's a great proclamation of a prophecy or anything like that. It represents one person's struggle. In a sense, he's identifying with Job, struggling with God.
Mm.
But Jung is struggling with the Christian tradition and the whole Judeo-Christian religious tradition that shaped him, that formed European civilization. And he is wrestling with it and wrestling with how does God permit evil? Why did God create human beings that they could be so radically fallible? And he's he's in a sense put God on the witness stand, but also like on the therapist's couch and saying, let's look at some of the things you're saying here, like just how almighty you are, and just better watch out and obey my will, or else I can cause a lot of grief for you. This sounds pretty
Yeah.
megalomaniacal. Do you want to talk about what's going on at a deeper level, etc.? So, Answer to Job is kind of this unique piece of power. I think of it, you brought up Blake earlier. Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell
Yeah.
and Jung's Answer to Job have they and Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah.
It's as if they were written up on a mountaintop in a powerful thunderstorm and written with the light of lightning, it's
Yeah.
got that, they have this kind
Yeah.
of archetypal potency to them.
Yes. Well, that actually leads me on to something else I wanted to discuss. Earlier, you spoke about vertical time and horizontal time and vertical time, and this is something I've thought about deeply, that I've intuited deeply, that there are two different kinds of time, that there are two axes of time. One time is horizontal, it's linear, and it's entropic. This is why we pass through time, we have a continuum, and we die. Yeah, we perish. I intuit another kind of time that links us to what I understand to be simultaneous time. This is my understanding of reality, that all time exists now at other dimensions, that the universe is some sort of hyperdimensional jewel-like object, and we're just at one level. And what you just said about Blake and Nietzsche and Jung, as if they're all at the top of a mountain, kind of receiving this divine knowledge, it's almost like they could be writing at the same time. And there are certain moments in history, the axial age with Plato, Pythagoras, etc., the Romantic project, yeah, the 1960s, and that utopian impulse that occurred then. There are certain moments in history, certain souls seem to channel information from the beyond, from the absolute, that comes from a higher time, that I believe they are receiving like a cascade of information from this vertical time, because it tends to be characterized by a kind of future envisioning, like a future vibration of time. You have Plato imagining the republic, the ideal city. You have a poet like Novalis. He speaks of, and he was very emphatic about Sophia, by the way, and the Sophia consciousness. He speaks about the inexhaustible cup of the golden future. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are there, and how this might relate to Kairos and archetypes and archetypal moments in time.
Yeah, no, I think you're because higher times involve a kind of access to timelessness, to eternity, and that was Plato's realm of the archetypal ideas or forms, capital I, capital F, beautiful things and moments and people, flowers, etc., emerge and then die in the course of linear time, but they are all beautiful to the precise extent in Plato's and the Platonic traditions vision. They are all beautiful to the precise extent that they are participating in timeless
Mm.
beauty, the very principle of the beautiful with a capital B. And one of the interesting things about your arresting image there of how, for example, Blake and I mean Blake and Jung and Nietzsche in with those particular works, and you could think of some of Shakespeare's plays, or you could think of the Moby Dick by Melville, or people things like that that just have this great intensity of it's as if they're all in the coming from in the same place and
Yeah.
time in some
Yes.
ways. That's a
Yes.
beyond time and place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And this helps explain one of the peculiarities of experiences of a dawning of a new age, the
Mm.
dawning
Mm.
of a utopian future of love and peace. And I mean, like people in the 60s were feeling like it just around the corner. And that was certainly true among the early Christians. There was such a powerful sense. They didn't think that um, they thought it would happen in their lifetime. That's why there was such a focus on living purely. There wasn't like not so much like how do you create families that will have children and then an enduring society. The focus was on the purity of your soul and the communal experience of love in that uh, community of agape, participating in the divine love. That was big focus. Why? Because not only was that the highest good, but it was also preparing ourselves for the moment that this would at last come, this kind of climax of history, this realm of peace and love and utopian creativity and so forth. Now, in that state, you can be so sure that it's just around the corner that you can literalize it and just put a like, and then predictions come,
Yeah.
prophecies, it's
Yeah.
going to happen on this date,
By
etc.
2012, etc.
Yeah, and one can get kind of literalist about it. And I think it has something to do with the fact that that one is, as you were describing, you're going along within this horizontal quantitative time, but you're tapping into this qualitative vertical higher dimension that where it's already present.
Yes.
And in Christian theology, it's the difference between a kind of what they call realized eschatology, or a more anticipatory eschatology that you're moving towards it. But the realized is that redemption's already happened. Christ has already come. We're already here. Anyway, it's that tension between these two forms of end times eschatology, or these two experiences of time in a more literal, horizontal, linear continuum, versus the patient in a higher dimension, that I think can create some of those confused literalist prophecies of this is what's this is when it's going to happen at last. Also with the total assurance that it is going to happen.
Yeah, Terence McKenna has spoken about that. He sort of couches it as a like a strange attractor, like a,
Yeah,
as I'm sure you're aware, magnetic attractor at the end of time sort of thing, and that actually in the grand scheme of time, of chronological time, it could be in the next 5 years, the next 50 years, or next 500 years, because these are tiny swathes of time in that larger spectrum. But he saw it as, we're catching a glimpse. This really resonates with me. It's like we're
yeah.
catching a glimpse of this attractor, this omega point. Something I wanted to talk about was
So
this.
2012, he did kind of lock on to 2012 though,
Yeah,
as
yeah. He did, but I heard him in an interview acknowledging that 2012 is like a fulcrum, but even
yeah,
if it's like 500 years after, it's still orienting around the 2012 fulcrum sort of thing.
in some way.
Yeah, something I wanted to explore was this notion of chronological time and the soul. I've heard you quote Keats. The quote he says, John Keats says, "Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making." We've just been speaking about this tension between a higher time and chronological time, Kairos and Kronos. What do you think it is about the material realm in which we live and chronological time that somehow makes it a crucible for soul making, a veil of soul making?
Yes. Well, if you read that letter that Keats, he was writing to his brother, 1819, and he was wanting to say that, compared with what many Christians were teaching at that point, I don't think representing the profoundest side of Christianity, but were teaching more that this world was like the the veil of tears, but it was also, this is what we're going to get redeemed from by the sudden intervention from above of Christ and his return, and then everything's solved. While he wanted to say, I think a much better description of life is that it is this is the, and of this world as being a veil of soul making. And by soul, he had in mind, and the making of soul, he had in mind the forging of an identity. He uses that word, and the forging of like who you are, that can only come through experience, which means it can only come through suffering as well as the joys of temporal life over time. We have an expression which I love. I think it's a biblical expression, in the fullness of time. And certain things can only happen in the fullness of time. And we don't necessarily know when that fullness will be reached. Uh, when, one will find one's beloved in the fullness of time, or when some deep ache or suffering or personal burden will finally be lifted in the fullness of time. We don't know when that will happen, but it is something that emerges over time, through time. Time, time, I think of, and here we can think of Kronos and the temporal continuum of time, et cetera. It's like the birth canal of eternity, of entering back into eternity. It's it forges an identity, becoming who one is, becoming one's unique individual self. There, this is Keats's view of this is different from, let's say, a a certain emphasis within many mystical traditions that individuality is what you want to get rid of, you want to get out of, you want to just move to the universal. This
Mm.
is your sense of individuality is an illusion of Maya. It's pushing you into experiences of suffering, and you want to get out of the cycle of rebirth and experience nirvana. And this is a somewhat different understanding that I think it also has deep spiritual and mystical profundity. And that is the idea that our very individuality
Mm.
can become a vessel of the divine, can become a vessel of the cosmic creativity. Because again, as I was saying, we're not, you can think of your individuality as you're a particular flower and you're in a potted plant, that you are a potted plant that is separate from everything else. But if you instead think of you're a flower, you're a tree, but you're planted in the earth itself. You are the earth blossoming forth in that unique way that is Arabella or Rick or the oak tree or the whale or the butterfly. And to actualize that individuality is part of the fullness of the cosmic and divine creativity. And it can only happen through the fullness of time unfolding. And it often requires making mistakes and suffering losses and experiencing a deepening of soul, because the shallower life was defeated and the shallower identity was defeated. I think Keats is really getting at that understanding of soul as reflecting something that can only be made in the crucible of life.
Yes. And when you say made, do you think that also includes a kind of disclosure and revealing? And you spoke about how this is sort of antithetical to the Eastern tradition of negating the self, losing the self. I know Jung spoke a lot about how he was really doing the opposite. He wanted to actually grapple with the contents that were being presented to him. Do you think our identity or our self is a sort of this blueprint exists before we're born, and really time is the stage for the unfolding through which it is disclosed or revealed to us? Almost like, I think it was Michelangelo who said, I saw the angel in the marble and I carved until I set him free. The
Right.
marble, the angel was in the marble, it's there, realize, and he just has to chip away. What are your
Yes.
thoughts on that and the kind of a kind of cosmic disclosure through dreams, through archetypes, and of course, archetypal astrology, like the fact that we're born with a natal chart that's going to inform our unfolding?
Yeah.
There was a lot there, sorry.
I was going to say we're getting into some great deep topics, but of course we've been engaging with pretty deep mysteries this whole time. I think there is a deep way in which we are unfolding a kind of destined potentiality within each of us. And it is simultaneously something like that involves a kind of perhaps, an actualization, a fulfillment in this. Hillman in James Hillman in his book A Soul's Code, of course, has that whole metaphor that he's drawing from Aristotle on the acorn, in a sense, contains the oak tree
Mm.
right at the very
Mhm.
beginning. But then it needs other things to become actualized, and then that the final cause is is luring forth the the whole evolution of that form to into fulfillment, to realization. I think there is something very true about that perspective, and that we often are are fortunate in our lives if we have that realization at some point, like, oh, this is what I was meant to do, or this is who I am. Um, this is why these things happened to me. This is why I wasn't, why I suffered that injury and I wasn't able to become what I thought I was supposed to become there, but or I lost
Yeah.
that relationship that I was sure that's
Yeah.
who, and then this whole other reality unfolds that I recognize is actually a deeper truth for myself. And it's the same thing with works of art. You brought up Michelangelo, and
Mm.
I think that's also, if you've ever, you know, when we hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, like dun 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 dun, and if you hear that first movement, for example, it's hard it's hard to imagine how it could have been any other way. It
Yeah.
just seems to have this kind of titanic inevitability from the first note to the last.
That's
Uh,
brilliant.
until it climaxes and fulfills itself. And but here's what's really interesting is Beethoven did a tremendous amount of revising. I mean, he sometimes would revise so much till the paper got you went right through the eraser went right through the paper. And one time back in the 1950s, this is how old I am, Leonard Bernstein, he used to have with the New York Philharmonic every week, there would be something called Young People's Concerts. And well, actually, this was a different series called Omnibus. And he, one time on this kind of cultural series that was everybody, there was only three stations back then in three networks in all of the United States, and plus the public TV. And on this, this cultural program that everybody could see who tuned into it on a Sunday afternoon, he set out the different versions of the Fifth Symphony that as Beethoven was getting there. And he had the orchestra play the earlier drafts, as it were, and then gradually move one draft at a time till he got to the way we now hear it. And it's remarkable. You can just hear how every step of the way, you can see how it's coming, but it's not there yet. This isn't right. There's something the drama's not fully there yet, or the architectonic perfection hasn't been reached yet. And Beethoven's recognizing that as he's composing, but he has to do it step by step, just as our lives have to
Yes.
make these steps, but be endlessly self-revising. I love a saying I saw many years ago on a sign outside a town in California. It said, "Experiment endlessly and keep humble," which I think is a good motto. So Beethoven, he knew it wasn't there yet, and he kept having to revise it until it got to what it was supposed to be. And I think Nietzsche has this very strong in Zarathustra, where he is constantly saying, "Become what thou art."
Yes.
It's not like become what you are to become in the future. It's become what thou art. There's some way in which you
Yes.
already are
It's
this.
realized
Yeah,
already.
that's
Yeah.
right. Or but we have to get there is a journey. And it involves a journey to the underworld of the crucible of transformation and the Kairos moment and the crisis.
Yes. Yes. Um, want to finish on the collective patterning that's occurring right now and this shift that Jung also spoke about moving from the Christian era, the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. How can we detect this kind of kairotic moment? What are the expressions of this archetypal signature in our collective now that confers that we are indeed in the Kairos?
Well, if you look at, I mean, I used to say this 25 before the turn of the millennium, but it's so much more intensely visible today, tangible. You can see how so many of the major characteristics, features of our time and of our crisis, like the sense of the looming danger, or the sense of great suffering, of of tremendous uncertainty, the sense that when the very foundations of reality are falling apart, and or the foundations of our social structures or our ethical standards or whatever are just going through some kind of dissolution, the sense of being completely disoriented as a result, the encounter with death, with suffering, mortality, not just individual, but on the planetary scale.
Yeah.
You can see how every one of these features of our time, including the sense that even what do we really know, and are we going crazy? That those are all, every single thing that I just mentioned are characteristics of an initiatory rite of passage,
Right.
of a ritual of transformation.
Mm, mm,
And the uncertainty that we feel about how are we going to come out of this is the uncertainty that every initiate feels as they're going through if you don't have that uncertainty, you don't forge the soul, you don't forge the possible transformation. You I often say, like, you can't have a pretend near-death experience. You really have to feel
yeah.
like you're
Yeah. You're gonna die.
you're dying, or you're going to die, in order to have the 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 potency to bring about the transformation of consciousness at such a deep level. So that's why weekend workshops never quite match the sudden epiphany of an NDE,
Mm,
so, or any kind of, yeah, sudden encounter with one's mortality, or facing it in a loved one, that you're caring for, or something like that. Those all have such a profound influence. So the great signs of this being a kairotic moment
yeah.
are very much like what Jung was pointing to in that essay that we started our discussion with, the Undiscovered Self essay that he wrote. And that is the time we live in is going through a kind of catastrophic encounter with the limits of our modus vivendi, and the basic assumptions with which we viewed nature, human beings' relationship to the nature, human beings' relationship to each other, men's relationship to women, our relationship to other animal
Mm,
species, our relationship to the cosmos, which has been, for 400 years, a disenchanted cosmos, one in which we are the only conscious, intelligent, purposeful, spiritually and morally aspiring beings in the whole known universe, and therefore we're superior to it. And the universe is just matter and energy of an entirely neutral form that has no intrinsic meaning, no intrinsic purpose. It's completely indifferent to everything that is most precious to us in our souls as human beings. And so we live in a state of alienation from this whole. It leaves us with a spiritual hunger that, of course, is compensated for by a consumerist frenzy of needing more and more material objects, because that's the only reality that we really believe in, and therefore we have to exploit and decimate the earth in order to feed this hunger. Anyway, you can see how that entire orientation that we've been living within has reached an absolute crisis point. To me, the greatest challenge is going to be, can enough people in who have some connection to the levers of power recognize what we're talking about here in such a way that they can make a difference before there's different levels of, we're already in a catastrophe, we're already in a
mm,
mass extinction, fastest, largest since 66 million years ago, and even faster and it's all being caused by one species presence on the planet. If there already is vast suffering by many, many human beings, and by many of our non-human brothers and sisters in the life world, the animals, the plants,
Mhm.
etc., and the air, the water. But the question is, how catastrophic? And if enough people can wake up to the reality of what we're already facing and also have enough spiritual trust in life and in the cosmos to be able to hold a kind of centered equilibrium for for the larger circles of human beings that we're in relationship to, who will not necessarily have that sense of centered trust. If we can if we can be participate in what I call heroic communities,
Yeah.
heroic in the sense of having a higher, a vision of the good and of
Hmm.
the higher, that is different from the mainstream society,
Yeah.
but to do it as a community, because individuals aren't going to pull this off. We need
Yeah.
communities to support each other and to have a certain coherence, but at the same time, communities that support this individuation of every member of it, not become
Yeah. Yeah.
a cult un, of just one belief system. Then there's a possibility of turning the ship so that the iceberg that is clearly in front of us on the horizon, we might be able to minimize or at least lessen the amount of pain and suffering and loss that's already been initiated. And I'm, for biographical reasons, perhaps, and I don't know, karmic or whatever, I do have a certain trust in life, in the cosmos, and also in the better angels of even our of our nature, to use Abraham Lincoln's description of his hope for the American people, that the better angels will kind of have get the upper hand in our
Mm.
psychic dynamics, and be able to move forward in a really life enhancing and creative and self-aware way, or more self-aware. We're always seeing through a glass darkly to some extent, but anyway, that was a bit of a
No, that's beautiful. Thank you. I think the final thing I really do want to finish on, and I couldn't close the conversation without bringing this in some crystallizing sense, and it is to do with the aesthetic dimension. You kind of alluded to this just now, but so often, and you've mentioned this in your work, massive breakthroughs occur with a sort of aesthetic revelation. Some of our greatest minds, they have inferred great knowledge, and it has involved a sort of aesthetic quality. Beauty has played such an important role in what you're describing, the initiation, the uncertainty. It's very chaotic. And the world out there, I mean, it's looking pretty ugly. The kind of burlesque, grotesque, decadent state of affairs. I mean, it's not beautiful. It's not beautiful. And this is quite an abstract question, but to what extent do you think the aesthetic dimension is required, for us to creatively elevate ourselves and sort of return to the truth, the beautiful, the true, and the good?
yes, beauty can give us, it's like a disclosure of the eternal, but there's different levels of beauty. There's shallow beauty, there's misleading beauty, there's the shiny new object, etc. And then there's also a kind of profound beauty that even like a person, when one's a child and one has a beloved grandmother or grandfather, and they have they have wrinkles and they're bent over, but there's a kindliness in their eyes, and there's a wisdom in what and their presence in that grandchild's life. The grandchild doesn't for a second think, oh, that person's old and ugly. they're seeing the beauty of that person, and so there's a kind of soul beauty there that is very important. There's also just been such in modernity, even in the most aesthetic judgment is a very complex subject, but and phenomenon. But if you go to different towns and cities, villages around the world, and you look at many of the buildings, the architecture, et cetera, that existed prior to the 20th century, or even prior to the last 50, uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then you look at the ones that were built since then, it is just like night and day. And
Travesty, actually, what happened
yeah,
from the 60s. It's a travesty.
and the beauties of like even even older schools, universities, et cetera, compared with the very functionalist modern aesthetic, it can, yeah, Prince Charles, now King Charles, has had a whole lifetime of kind of making this point. And I think so. I'm first of all just trying to complexify the sense of beauty, that it's not just necessarily who wins that year's beauty contest or what somebody says, oh,
Yes.
it's beautiful. It
Yes,
could
of course.
it's
But
it,
wouldn't you agree that we need to, when I say we, I mean like the kind of not you and me, but the collective, we need to educate people. People need to be educated and informed about the meaning of true beauty. Because it's the beauty industry is really means the cosmetic industry. And we've
yes,
completely lost touch with beauty with a capital B, and as architecture, the architectural sort of deterioration, I think, is reflective of the meaninglessness inherent in our society.
yes. Well, it's very characteristic, and this is getting back to the ugliness that you described as being so real, so in our
And
face,
affronting. Yeah.
in our current reality, ecological, political, social, the media, etc. It's very characteristic of the initiatory journey of spiritual transformation that one has to experience deep ugliness,
Mm.
has to go through it. It's part of the underworld. It's part of the plutonic monstrous. As it unfolds and as that longer journey unfolds, it seems to be part of the great mystery of how the opposites are connected, is that when one moves out of the the ugly depredations of the journey through the underworld and then emerges into rebirth and the perfection of the new, when one opens one's eyes after having gone through a very profound journey, and suddenly you can hardly take in the beauty of the sky, the trees, the birds that just landed on the tree, the song that the bird is singing. Suddenly, one is hearing the divine, the sunset. It's not just, oh, isn't that a beautiful sunset with those colors? It's an epiphany of divine beauty and that's a state of consciousness, and it seems to be something that we may be graced with just a sudden epiphany out of the blue, but it also seems to be something that is very much part of the death rebirth mystery and part of the initiatory rite of passage that can take many different forms, whether it's coming of age initiations or near death experiences or spiritual emergencies or an ayahuasca journey or etc. And so I like you mentioned, we've talked about before, like Hillman's dictum about it is beauty that will draw soul back to the world, that will save the world in some
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
and recognizing the deep beauty of nature, which is something and the beauty of the cosmos and the beauty of the newborn child is something that you have to kind of wake. It's easy in the modern, shallow, overdriven, busy life to just that also can be hyper urban and technological, mechanistic, just glued to our smartphones or or our computer screen. Present moment exception is present moment accepted. That's the double-edged sword of all
Right.
technology. Of course, it can be life enhancing or it can be quite the opposite.
Yeah.
But there are so many people who don't even have the experience of or the opportunity to experience a walk in the woods, an experience of being immersed in the wilderness and reconnecting to the spiritual depths and the spiritual beauty that's there. Um, but yeah, so there is something about Plato's basic view that in some sense beauty is a kind of intimation of or a lure for us to evolve and enter into a higher state of consciousness where we experience archetypal beauty and archetypal goodness. I think it's important. You talked about our sense of beauty, the cosmetic beauty, the shallow beauty, which can often be in certain ways ugly, certainly spiritually ugly. Uh,
Yes.
and it seems to me that what is most beautiful is also the most good and the most true.
Yes.
And same thing with the good. The good also has problematic forms like moralism, and
Right.
which can be quite unbeautiful, constricting, and etc., all in the service of the good. But the highest good has a certain, and deepest good has a certain deep beauty to it, and also a deep truth to it. And so that's why I think the true, the beautiful, and the good, capital letters each for
Yes.
each of those, in a sense, need each other to reach their fullness, their depth, their realization in this kind of archetypal form that
Yeah.
we're gesturing towards. So that's maybe a thought to leave us with, is just the how the good, the true, and the beautiful, in some sense, need each other in to permit the fullness of each of them, the realization of each of them.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I could speak with you for like 3 hours, and I know you've got lots to do, and I'm really grateful for your giving your time. This has been incredibly rich and has given me lots of food for thought. So
Oh, well, I'm
thank
really
you.
glad. Yeah, it's very such deep subjects that we do our best to touch on in our limited time,
So there was a
which
lot. We covered a lot of ground. You covered a lot of ground, so I'm very grateful.
it's getting late your
Yeah,
time.
yeah, it's bedtime. It's bedtime.
All
Bye.
right.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to go deeper into my work and find out about my offerings at the Temple, my School of Consciousness and Metaphysics, just head to my website, www.arabellatais.com, for more information, all the links in the show notes. See you next time.